must occur to give it a more specific focus. This test was funny, really, because Seth was doing beautifully on his own. Then he threw the ball to me, and I nearly fell flat on my face. The envelope item was a bill of Rob's, dated July 15, 1966. The session was on August 1st. I'd been with Rob at the lumber yard when he got the bill. Rob had purchased 2 4x8-foot pieces of masonite and a roller pan. The salesman who waited on us became quite talkative when he learned that Rob was going to use the masonite for paintings. He told us that a European artist had done a portrait of him while he'd been a soldier in World War II. Somewhat humorously, he described how the artist had drawn his face as though it were symmetrical and without blemish, while actually it was quite asymmetrical with an impaired eye. The salesman also wore glasses. Here are some of Seth's impressions. 4 square, or 4 and 4 square. We thought this was very good. Rob had the 2 pieces of masonite cut in half so they'd fit into our car. This gave him 4 pieces, each 4 foot square. Writing on printing on the lower left-hand corner, very small, holding the object horizontally. Something on the back also. Both of these applied, except that the very small print was on the left side, not on the left corner. 1966. Looking forward to 1967. Written on the bill is the date and the year 1966, and underneath, account forwarded. A connection with a photograph or other like object. This, we believe, refers quite validly to the portrait. An oval shape or eye shape, that is, this kind of an eye, inside of a rectangle or triangle, you see. According to Rob's notes, I pointed to one of my own closed eyes. The salesman, as mentioned earlier, specifically mentioned his poor eye in connection with his portrait and his glasses. Connection with transportation and with water. A rather unique way of referring to a 10-mile car trip to Wellsburg. The name on the town appears on the bill. So, incidentally, does the word carload on the back. A word beginning with M and another M, this time the initial of a name. Rob had purchased masonite by its brand name, but the salesman listed it as Prestwood on the bill. A capital M appears in the bill's heading, Glenn M. Schulier. A rectangular item with some dark coloring on it, perhaps dark blue. The bill is rectangular. The back of it is printed in heavy black. All in all, Seth gave 24 impressions. Each of them did apply, though some were not as specifically connected as others. For example, Seth said, connection with black, symbolic of death, and with a tournament, again symbolic, as a crossing of swords. We believe that this was a reference to World War II, when the salesman who waited on us had his portrait done as a soldier. Another example was this. Numbers, perhaps 01913. The bill did have numbers on it, and in a series that began with 0. This seemed unusual to us, but not in the order given by Seth. One series begins with 09, not 019, and the last 2 digits, 1 and 3, do appear by themselves on the front of the bill. Up to this point, the impressions had come through with no concern on my part. I was in a deep trance. Then Seth said, the feeling of something hanging over, threatening or overhanging, on the upper half of the object, and dark. As I spoke these words for Seth, a rift seemed to open up, a doubt as to the information's interpretation. I knew that Seth wanted me to narrow this down myself, and that this was part of my training. I had the feeling of something very heavy hanging over me. Was this to be translated into an object, like, say, a heavy roof over my head, or to an emotional feeling that, quote-unquote, hung over me? I didn't know, and at that point I couldn't figure it out. The correct, specific connection wasn't made. Seth threw me another. Something bright and small also, beneath this overhanging or threatening portion. Here again, left to my own devices, I couldn't work my way to the specific data we wanted. Yet Seth was trying to lead me to the word roofing. It was in the heading of the bill, on the upper half. See how correct and yet ambiguous that unfinished impression was? The feeling of something hanging over, threatening or overhanging, on the upper half of the object, and dark. The second impression that I was supposed to complete, something bright and small beneath this overhanging or threatening portion, was to lead me to the word roller pan, which also appeared on the bill beneath the word roofing. A roller pan is small, bright and shiny, and the one Rob purchased that day had been a shiny aluminum color. Here, Seth's impressions had been quite literal, as if the words on the bill were coming to life and being described as objects instead of as words describing objects. Later, I was to do much better when Seth left some impressions up to me, but this kind of training was invaluable. Even though I didn't do a very good job, we learned something of the nature of perception, which was Seth's intent. This test made us suspect that all impressions, extrasensory or otherwise, are initially non-verbal and non-visual, more like pure feeling that is only later interpreted into sense terms. We tried all sorts of things with the envelopes. In the New York Times test, Rob himself didn't know what was on the test object. He didn't always know what the test object was, in any case, and sometimes he didn't even know that a test would be held. For example, occasionally friends would come unannounced to a session and bring their own test envelope. This was just handed to me in the middle of the session, without my knowing beforehand whether or not a test would be held. Sometimes Rob would use such an envelope at once. At other times, he would save it for a future session. It didn't seem to make any difference in the results whether Rob knew what the test envelope contained or not. One night, Nora Stevens, not her real name, came unannounced. She was the friend of a friend and had attended 2 sessions previously. During this period, we encouraged people to drop in with test envelopes, though actually few did. Before and after this, we preferred to keep our sessions private. We knew that Nora was a secretary in a hospital office that had to do with the purchase of drugs and supplies, but that she had nothing to do with the patients, their records, or medical procedures. I didn't know she'd brought an envelope. She slipped it to Rob after the session began. Seth said, "A connection with a family record, as a page, for example, from a book. Connected also with a turbulent event or unpleasantness. 4 numbers in a row, and other numbers. The initial M, a connection with another city." After the session, we opened the envelope. It contained a patient's record sheet, a page from a pad that Nora had picked out of a wastebasket at another office. At the bottom corner were 4 numbers in a row, with other numbers on the top by the patient's name, Margaret. Her hometown also began with an M. She was from out of town. A hospital stay is certainly unpleasant, often turbulent. Seth also gave other impressions concerning the woman's background, but we couldn't check these out. Yet sometimes I'd get discouraged even over good results. One test had pleased me no end at first. It was our 37th, held in the 237th session on March 2nd, 1966. The target item was a print Rob had taken of his own hand a week earlier. when we were reading some books on palmistry. Seth's impressions couldn't have been more concise. I went around the house with a smile on my face, just thinking of it for days afterward. I was doing the dishes when a drawback suddenly occurred to me. Rob was in the living room. I went in, slowly. I bet Dr. Instream would throw out the results of that handprint test because we both worked on palmistry the week before, I said. He might, Rob admitted, but the fact is, we've received plenty of letters that I could have used since then. We also did work in handwriting analysis. I could have used one of those samples. I could have used something older than you are, as I've done before. I could have used anything. No matter what we use, Seth still has to describe a particular item, and those impressions weren't general. They could only refer to that specific handprint. I agreed with him, but after that, Rob often made up several test envelopes at once, shuffled them, and then chose one just before a session. And what about the in-stream tests? First of all, I kept waiting to hear what Dr. Instream thought about my 2 out-of-body episodes, and he simply never mentioned them. To me, this was terribly disappointing. The results had checked out, whether or not they could be considered scientific. If these didn't convince him that something was going on, I didn't see what would. The overall results of our own envelope tests encouraged us to hope that Seth was doing fairly well on the regular in-stream data too. We started these with zeal and energy. For 1 year, twice a week, Seth gave his impressions as to Dr. Instream's activities. These included specific references as to names, initials, dates, and places. Some of this data could be easily checked out. Dr. Instream wanted Seth to concentrate on naming a particular object, though, upon which he would be concentrating in the distant town in which he lived. It became obvious that emotional elements were more important, that activities of an emotional nature, quote-unquote, came through more clearly than impressions of a more neutral object. Seth did give material pertaining to objects also, but he was more apt to give specific information on Dr. Instream's daily life. One of our favorite topics of conversation that year was when will we hear from Dr. Instream? For months on end we would hear nothing. Perhaps, we thought, he wanted to give us no reports until the experiments were finished. If so, why didn't he just tell us? When finally the suspense was too much for me, I would write. Were we getting any hits or weren't we? Dr. Instream always assured us of his continuing interest, told us to go on with the tests, and said that he had no evidence yet strong enough to, quote-unquote, convince the hard-nosed psychologist. But that was all. He said nothing about the numerous names and dates, the visitors or letters mentioned in the sessions. Was the data all wrong? Partially right? We never found out. He never told us. Knowing that Dr. Instream would be concentrating on each session put me under a strain, perhaps because of my own attitude. But now I felt that I really had to have a session each Monday and Wednesday evening, come hell or high water. And even when we were alone,